Namaskar and welcome to ISSF SAMVAAD, a show where we invite the brightest minds to discuss and deliberate on topics related to international relations and geopolitics. On today's show, we have a very special guest, Dr. Scott Moore. Dr. Moore is the Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania. He also directs four high impact research and engagement fund programs. Prior to this, Dr. Moore has worked at World Bank and the US Department of State. Today, Dr. Moore joins us to talk about his new book, China's Next Act: How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. Dr. Moore, namaste. It is an honor and privilege for us to invite you over here. Kindly accept our heartiest congratulations on the publication of your new book.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. So unfortunately, in India, we do not have the print version of your book. So we had to make do with the Kindle version. I do not know if you can see it.
Yes, I have. Yes, I can see that. Yes.
Yes. So, but still, sir, it is a brilliant read. I read it cover to cover, and and sir, let us start with the questions. Sir, for most of us, China is an enigma, right, sir? It is very unpredictable. It is a secretive thing. So we want to know what's China's game plan heading into the 21st century.
Thank you very much for the question, and I'm very excited to have this opportunity. As I understand, SAMVAAD, the meeting is something close to dialogue, and I'm very much interested in dialogue with your institution and with those in India who think about international affairs and strategic issues, particularly, of course, related to China. So by way of answering your question, it may be helpful for me to explain a little bit why I wrote the book. And I wrote the book because I did have the opportunity to spend a period of time as an academic fellow at the US Department of State. And during that time, I had a portfolio that's called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. It's a very wide-ranging portfolio, and at the time it involved everything from climate change to civil space cooperation and many other things as well, public health. And through that experience, I became convinced that China's role in the world and therefore China's relationship with many other countries, especially the United States, is increasingly being defined by the need to cooperate in some sense to address global challenges, especially those related to environmental issues like climate change, but also, of course, pandemic prevention and public health, which we've seen dominate the global landscape over the last 2 years. And then also to have some type of engagement or relationship on science and technology issues. Technology is, of course, advancing very quickly, and China's role in advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and biotechnology is also evolving very quickly, making China a key player in the global discussion on how to address and deal with the many issues that those advanced technologies present, as well as China playing, as well as those issues playing an increasingly important role in China's relationship with other countries. So I think in response to your question, there is, of course, many ways of answering that. There's an economic dimension, there's a geopolitical dimension, but my argument in the book is that for China's sort of position in the world in the 21st century, the two most important issue areas are China's role in global public goods, especially environmental issues on one hand, and then in the development of advanced technologies on the other.
Thank you so much, sir. So moving on to the public health domain. So you have dedicated a chapter in your book to this fact. And when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic and the origin of it, if you look at the past 2 decades, China has been at the epicenter of many viruses. And there has been calls from the global community for China to take a greater responsibility for public health. So, do you think that these calls are justified? Because if you see, then if China has to take a greater responsibility, it has to also alter a lot of its cultural habits. So, do you think this call of China taking greater responsibility is justified in your view?
Um, I think there are several reasons, and I go into this in the book, why China is particularly important to global public health and especially pandemic prevention. Though I should maybe add that China's role in global public health in general has been increasing quite a bit over the last 15 years or so. And China is becoming an important financier of global public health initiatives around the world. Switching to, and you know, I mean, the best example of that was China's role in providing vaccines to Pakistan and other Philippines and other countries around the world. Um, with respect to pandemic prevention in particular, though, that I think is China's single most important role in global public health, because for a variety of reasons, mainland China is particularly vulnerable to outbreaks of new viral diseases. And because of China's connectivity to the rest of the world, those are quite vulnerable to spreading very quickly to other parts. So I do think that that's a really important role. I do go into in the book several reasons why China's response to new kind of outbreaks has been problematic from an international point of view. But I do think it's fair to say that China has made a lot of progress over the last few years. China has invested very heavily in improving its healthcare system, which just 10 or so years ago was really kind of in a shambolic state. The state has invested quite a bit in improving that capacity. The capacity of its healthcare system has dramatically expanded health insurance coverage, which has done a lot to improve care. So those are important steps, but there are a lot of holes that remain. And in particular, a concern is the extent to which, particularly officials at local level, still have a lot of incentives to downplay or to try to hide, essentially, new outbreaks. Now, China's zero COVID policy may have changed that somewhat. The structure is so stringent and strict, and data collection is so comprehensive that it may be very difficult for officials to hide outbreaks going forward. But then, you know, we'll have to see what the attitude of the central government would be in that case. But there has been a lot of improvement in that area, and I think with the right kind of investment by international leaders and public health leaders, that can be an area of expanded dialogue with China.
Thank you, sir. So we will now move to the domain of clean technology. So if you'll see, China is an absolute leader when it comes to solar technology, wind technology, and other green technology. So what is the reason? Is it because of the state-led intervention, or is it some other reason? What are your views on this?
Certainly, China's approach to the development of clean technology has relied very heavily on an extremely kind of state-led and state-centered model, where the involvement of the state has been really significant in the dramatic growth of China's clean tech sector. In part, that's because of various forms of subsidies, though most of them have been indirect. The more significant source of assistance has been policy support, so just very favorable regulation. It's things all the way down to, for anyone who's been to China, you'll know that you know, like many highly populated places around the world, traffic is a big problem. And in certain cities, it's been true now for almost a decade that in practice, one of the only ways you can get a new car registration is for it to be an electric vehicle, for example. So there are lots of ways in which, through regulation and policy, the state has encouraged the growth of clean tech sectors. So that's been a very important part of the development of China's sector overall. But there are also just fundamental economic factors that have promoted the growth of China's clean tech sector, and in particular, the concentration of manufacturing capacity in China for lots of key components that just has no parallel elsewhere in the world. A lot of elements of the solar panel supply chain, for example, are concentrated in China, all the way from polysilicon, one of the essential raw materials, all the way through to assembly of the cells and panels themselves, is all concentrated in China. And thanks to China's unparalleled economies of scale, that solar industry is able to be very cost competitive in a way that's just very hard for a lot of foreign competitors to address. The other piece of the puzzle, which was a significant concern until fairly recently, now it's not as much of a consideration, was technology transfer. Some of it involuntary, and sort of in many interpretations forced. There have been a lot of allegations of intellectual property theft around clean technologies from foreign firms that were subsequently adopted by Chinese firms. So that sort of technology transfer, both voluntary and involuntary, was also an important part of the development of that sector. So there was a lot of dependence and input by foreign firms. I should emphasize that while a lot of I think the media and policy attention has been on the kind of involuntary aspect of technology transfer, there was also a lot of voluntary technology transfer, and in particular through joint venture partnerships that were formed between foreign firms and Chinese clean tech companies and subsidiaries and partners.
Right, sir. So, sir, if we'll see, China is one of the major emitters of greenhouse gases. But when it comes to the per capita emission, it is like very less. So it is 10 point, if I'm not wrong, it is 10.1 tons per capita, whereas the United States per capita emission is much higher at 17.6. So if you'll see the people say, especially the people from China, they say that the original sin was of the West for the global climate crisis. So why should we pay the price for it with our by compromising our development? So how fair it is for the West to blame China for the emissions, and what are your views on that?
It's an important argument, and it certainly has a lot of practical substance to it, in the sense that it's almost impossible to imagine completely dismissing the argument around historical responsibility that Western countries bear the brunt of kind of this historical responsibility for accumulated emissions. That said, I think what's important to recognize is that China's emissions growth in this century, in the 21st century, has been so dramatic that the sum total actually approaches that of even kind of historically adjusted emissions. So it's such a big kind of piece of the puzzle that I think it's impossible to ignore China's responsibility to reduce emissions alongside that of other countries. Now, I think where the focus has shifted, and I mean that the point you raised was very much a topic of discussion and quite a bit of disagreement in international climate change negotiations, really until just the last 7 years or so. And since then, China has accepted quite a bit of responsibility to make ambitious commitments to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. So in a sense, China has accepted that it does have a key part to play in reducing global emissions. That said, I think everyone appreciates and understands that the more developed countries that are still much wealthier than China on a per capita basis do have a greater responsibility, thanks in part to their greater wealth and possession of clean technologies to decarbonize. I would also add that something that has occurred really in this time frame is that we have proven that it's possible to decouple GDP growth from growth in emissions. It's still very difficult to decarbonize economies, but it is possible to have economic growth without significant increases in carbon dioxide emissions and primary greenhouse gas. So in a sense, we've kind of over the last 2 or 3 decades shown a pathway to economic growth that doesn't necessarily have to depend on increasing greenhouse gas emissions. There is still a relationship, and that relationship is especially strong at the lower levels of economic development, where it's still difficult to imagine really lifting large numbers of people out of poverty without using fossil fuels to some extent. But as you kind of climb the income ladder, it becomes easier to envision ways to have growth without a corresponding economic growth, without a corresponding growth in emissions. So I think there's been a lot of opportunity there that didn't exist in the past, and I think that's a particularly important lesson for countries like India that are still growing very fast, but that have a lot more opportunities than existed just a few years ago to have that growth without necessarily having a corresponding growth in emissions.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. Now, sir, we'll move on to the technology domain. Sir, we'll talk about semiconductors. So, during the pandemic, we saw what importance did the semiconductors held, because we had issues with cars. In India, I do not know what is the situation back in the US, but in India, we had an year to 2 year delays in delivery of vehicles and other associated products due to the shortage of semiconductors. So if you'll see, sir, semiconductors are becoming an increasingly important commodity in today's world. China has a plan to dominate it. It is aggressively pursuing the semiconductor space. Whereas, sir, if you'll see Taiwan is also an undisputed leader in this domain. India also has its plan to become a leader in this domain. Japan is also trying, South Korea is also trying, and so does the US. So, according to you, who do you think will be the eventual winner?
I think, and semiconductors is a really interesting example, and it is, as you pointed out, a really key component of modern economy. And probably the single most important physical input into kind of high technology sectors and really advanced economies. So as you pointed out, there's a tremendous amount of competition in that space. It is important to recognize, though, that there's a lot of diversity in the semiconductor industry. Not every technology needs the most cutting edge or advanced semiconductors. A lot of systems and items can depend on less sophisticated chips. And that's where I think there is a little bit less kind of competition than it's commonly thought of. Certainly at the cutting edge, there's intense competition between China, the United States, Taiwan, others. But if you look at the sector as a whole, it's a very large, diverse sector. China is quite capable and sophisticated in the middle tier of the semiconductor space. So Chinese firms have not quite managed to catch up with Taiwanese firms in the most cutting edge chip technology and designs, but they are quite competitive thanks to the investment that you alluded to in kind of the middle tier. So I think to some extent it's a big market, it's a big sector, and there's maybe a little less kind of need for competition than we usually talk about, except at the very high end. All that being said, I think that for the foreseeable future, more advanced economies, including Taiwan, will remain ahead at the very cutting edge over China. I think over time you can, and this is true essentially across the science and technology domain, you'll continue to see the gap between the cutting edge being developed in the advanced industrialized countries and where Chinese firms are. You'll see that gap continue to shrink, but it will persist for some time.
Right, sir. So, on the similar note, we'll talk about the Huawei fiasco. Sir, the world is trying to move from 4G to 5G. And as of now, there are only a handful of players who operate in this domain of 5G. Sir, Huawei, sir, it has the early movers advantage. It is offering cheap technology which might appeal to the developing world, because the Chinese tech, they are very popular for being cost effective, but at the same time, the problem with Chinese tech is that there is a privacy concern, there is a security concern. So how do you see this being pan out? Like what is the final end game regarding this Huawei fiasco?
Well, I think it's another question that gets to a broader point that I make in the book, which is the kind of position, especially in the U.S. and Europe, when it comes to China and technology now, is to try to develop alternatives to Chinese supplied technology. Huawei, what makes Huawei and fifth generation telecommunications so interesting is that it's maybe the best example of where there currently isn't an obvious Western or foreign alternative to the kind of ecosystem that Huawei has developed around fifth generation telecommunications. And in that sense, it seems like Western countries will essentially have to, if they do want to develop an alternative to that, they're going to have to make a major investment in industrial policy, essentially. That's what you have seen both in the United States and in Europe as an effort to do that. I think it's certainly possible to do that technologically. There's not a major technological barrier to that. But there is a bit of an economic one in the sense that, again, this is true across a lot of science and technology domains. When you try to develop kind of so-called sovereign alternatives, in other words, kind of technologies or platforms that one country can have kind of control over, both commercially and politically, that's always more expensive than sourcing that technology from the global market, so to speak. And so it's always a more expensive proposition, and therefore I think will be confined to a few particularly important technologies. And in the book, I do argue that 5G is one of them for the reasons that you have laid out, because it's so fundamentally important to essentially the global communications backbone. And you don't want to have that potentially vulnerable to cyber intrusions, to disruptions, to espionage. So I do think it's sort of worth the investment, but it's also important to keep in mind that that investment will be very substantial, and it will be very expensive to replicate, to develop sovereign alternatives to the ecosystem that Chinese firms and especially Huawei provide.
Right, sir. So moving on, if you'll see this recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Russia and China, they came together after the invasion and they declared that their partnership has no limits. So how do you see this quote, like partnership with no limits, being manifesting into the technology space? Do you think that Russia has the caliber to support China?
I think in short, no, but there are some areas in which you could see some mutually beneficial research and development. I think that's particularly true in the military arena. So advanced jet engines, that's an area in which, at least according to my understanding, I'm not an expert on this topic, but according to my understanding, Russia retains an edge over its Chinese competitors in terms of advanced jet engines, and potentially has something to contribute to China's research base in technologies like artificial intelligence, hypersonic technology, and other things that are very much of interest from a military point of view. Given the long-standing cooperation between the Russian and Chinese militaries, I would expect that to be a really significant focal point for cooperation. I will add that on the other hand, Russia and China have really struggled to develop substantive ties in science and technology. There have been many attempts, but they've faltered for several reasons. I will also add that there was at least one case recently where kind of prominent Russian scientist was arrested and accused of spying for China. specifically on the development of hypersonic weapons. So there remain significant tensions in that area as well.
Right, sir. Sir, I'll just ask a follow-up question on that because I found it very interesting. So you mentioned about the IP theft, the intellectual property theft by the Chinese of the Russian tech. So if you look at their jet aircrafts, the J-11, the J-15, and their engines. So all are copies of Russian aircrafts, and because of that, the Russians are losing a very important chunk of their defense export. So do you think that that will be a problem for the relationship between China and Russia?
Well, I think with respect to the fourth generation fighter designs, sort of flanker derivatives, that was a source of tension about 10 years ago, but I have the sense that both countries kind of moved on past that. Russia sold China, I think it's a couple dozen flanker derivatives, Su-27 derivatives. Then China proceeded to develop its sort of own indigenous version of the flanker that if I understand correctly, Russia did maintain were not licensed. So that was a source of tension, but my sense is that has kind of been obviated by the Ukraine crisis and other developments since then. What I think is, where the focus has shifted are more advanced technologies, again, like hypersonic weapons development and things like that, where, as I say, I think there is some scope for greater cooperation between the two countries, but probably more likely to be contention as well.
Right, sir. Sir, moving on, sir, I have a question from the hydrology domain. Sir, India and China, we share a very large border. And there are a lot of transboundary river which have their origin in China and which flows into India. One of them is the Brahmaputra, as we call it, or the Sangpo, as the Chinese call it. So China is now on a spree to build dams right on the border, and every year when the flood seasons arrive in China, so we Indians, with our bated breath, we see whether these dams will break or not. And because a lot of a huge population density lives in the Brahmaputra Valley. So how should India approach this issue in your view?
Well, my interpretation of this issue, and I say this obviously as a kind of external observer, is that I think from an Indian perspective, the issue of transboundary water is very much tied to India's ongoing territorial disputes, including with China. And so I think from a kind of an Indian point of view, approaching this not just with respect to the water itself and the hydrology, but also thinking about the territory is important. One of the so I'll say there are two things that I think are specific priorities for dialogue and cooperation. One is hydrological data sharing, and especially flood risk monitoring. This is something that's been fairly successful, actually, between the Chinese and Indian governments over the past decade, is sharing of hydrological monitoring data that does allow an assessment of flood risk to be given. That data sharing partnership hasn't been perfect, but I think it's been fairly successful. It could and should be expanded. I think the second thing that would be a good opportunity for greater discussion and potential cooperation is around hydropower generation and power sharing. So India has been very heavily involved in several hydropower development projects in Nepal, for example. China is, as you pointed out, sort of undertaking various planning and feasibility studies for additional high dams in the upper Brahmaputra basin. Those have not been definitively approved, so I think it's still a little bit outstanding whether they would be built. But if they were to be built, the major advantage would be for hydropower generation. So again, there would be, I think, an opportunity for the governments to engage around could there be some type of power sharing agreement that would allow for the cross-border transfer of electricity generated from hydropower. I'll also point out that with respect to the Brahmaputra in particular, I was once told by a kind of very well-known Indian water policy expert that there was in fact a proposal made back in the 1970s by the UN, the United Nations Development Program, to build a large hydropower generation dam approximately where China's where one of the sites has been proposed for another large dam, and then to use the proceeds to be split between China, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and Bhutan, and to use that as a regional peace building as well as economic development exercise. So I think that remains a potentially promising example for cooperative rather than conflictual development if that plan proceeds.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. Sir, final question before we move on to the questions of our readers. Sir, the Belt and Road Initiative and the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So these two are the, if I may say so, babies of Xi Jinping. But these two pet projects, they are experiencing massive pushback from the countries in which they are being invested. So not only there is an issue of debt trap with regards to these projects, but also there is a climate side to it, the impact of climate. Because if you'll see, all these projects are being invested in developing countries, and so I don't think China finds it economically viable to invest into a greener technology while investing in the this BRI program. So, according to you, what is the impact of the BRI projects on the climate fight against climate change?
Well, it all depends. So Belt and Road investment projects include energy, so include power generation plants, as well as energy transport infrastructure, oil, natural gas pipelines, electricity grid projects, other things of that nature, and then a whole set of infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, etc. So I think you can sort of differentiate between those types of projects in terms of the climate impact. Obviously, the biggest impact is on the power generation side. So the extent to which BRI investment is producing new coal-fired power plants. There were several coal-fired power plants included under Belt and Road investment schemes. Those have, at least as far as we can tell, all been kind of, well, not exactly canceled. Several of those that are under construction will continue to be built. But going forward, China has committed to not financing any new coal-fired power plants overseas. So that is a positive step. Then you get, though, to fossil fuel infrastructure, especially for oil and gas. That does continue to be built under the Belt and Road, and that's obviously bad for the climate, especially to the extent that it produces sort of a lock-in effect. If a country is going to build natural gas pipelines and terminals now, it's probably going to use them for the next 20 to 30 years, as opposed to developing renewable alternatives. So that's probably bad news. On the infrastructure side, the impact is a little bit harder to calculate. In some cases, investment in railways, for example, may actually produce emissions relative to if the alternative is depending more on road transport, for example. But it really depends on the specific case in mind. And the other thing, of course, that has to be kept in mind is that the development of many of these projects does result in deforestation. That's a particular concern in Southeast Asia. The East Coast Railway, for example, several other mooted Chinese invested projects will sort of cut across sensitive tropical forests and particularly in that case, there will probably be a net negative effect on emissions because of destruction of these carbon sinks.
Right, sir. Sir, we'll move to some questions from our readers. So we asked them to submit questions for you, and we have received over 20 high quality questions, but we have filtered a few for you. Sir, Dexter, our reader, asks, do you see China weaponizing its rare earth reserves? And he further asks, is China capable of doing so?
I think capable of doing so to some degree, willing potentially, although the main case of this was directed specifically at Japan. Um, so I think it's certainly possible, but I would say that even the kind of prospect of that has produced an effort to diversify supplies of rare earth minerals around the world. There are new mines opening in the US, for example. So I do think it's going to be harder to weaponize rare earth minerals than maybe some assume.
Right, sir. Timothy, our reader, asks, does India benefit from the rise of China in the technology space, or is China's rise harmful to its interest?
I think both, and I think one theme that I draw out in the book is that the impact of China's rise, is both good and bad, and it really depends on the specific issue and area at play. And Huawei is an example I do talk a little bit about in the book, where the U.S. government under the Trump administration mounted a significant effort to persuade India to exclude Huawei from 5G network development. The Indian government, at least at the time, declined to do so, really, on cost grounds. It just offered much better technology at significantly lower prices. And I actually quote an anonymous official in the book who said something to the effect of, well, look, there may be some security concerns, but frankly, those are outweighed by the cost, the economic advantages. And I think, you do see that kind of calculation being made by several countries across the developing world when it comes to Chinese supplied technology. I think there is an increasing appreciation that there may be some security and cybersecurity sort of risks attached to the technology, but there are also often economic benefits. That's a calculation that different countries will make differently.
Right, sir. Sir, there is one very interesting question from Aditya Sinha. He asks, we recently had the real estate crisis in China. What would be its global repercussions, and will it spill over to the Chinese technology sector?
Well, I think the real estate sector is really fundamental to the Chinese economy. It's really one of the two big pillars of the Chinese economy, along with exports, along with export-led manufacturing. Arguably, the state would be a third pillar, but certainly it's one of the real pillars of the Chinese economy, and certainly the consumer part of the Chinese economy. So if there is any kind of impact in real estate, the effect on the Chinese economy will be substantial, and therefore on the global economy. And you have seen, some worrying signs in China's real estate sector. It's everything from overcapacity to kind of debt, just excessive debt in the sector, and then most recently to the same type of inflation and supply chain crunches that have affected lots of other markets around the world. I think one thing I would say, and this isn't my area of specialty, but just as sort of an observation, I think that the Chinese government has a lot of policy levers available to prop up essentially the real estate sector and to intervene to prevent a true crisis. So I think it's a concern, but it maybe wouldn't rank it as one of the top concerns when it comes to China, simply because I think the government does have quite a lot of ability to to intervene in that sector, and has done actually fairly successfully several times over the years to do things like curb excessive speculation in the sector.
Right, sir. So final question we'll take from, again, we have a question from Dexter. What technologies, according to you, are a priority for the Chinese Communist Party?
Certainly, well, there's a, this is in various 5-year plans and associated plans. But I think from a foreign perspective, some of the most, things like advanced aircraft engines make it in there. But I think from a foreign perspective, the two things that come up most often and that I focus on in the book are artificial intelligence and biotechnology. And in particular, I think that biotechnology, gene editing, synthetic biology is probably the single most important and disruptive technology area in this century. I think the development of those, particularly in those two biotech subsectors, are going to transform a lot of fields, and it's difficult to know now, what the ultimate implications will be, but we can say that they'll be substantial, and it's actually for that reason that I think the U.S., Chinese, Indian, and other governments need to start now talking about potential ethical, security, and other implications of that technology. I think we will need a lot more regulation and rule setting for those advanced biotechnologies.
Right, sir. Sir, on that note, we'll wrap up this conversation. And sir, what an honor it was for us to have you over here. And sir, we wish you all the success for your book. And we sincerely hope that we soon get the paperback and the hardcover in India. And sir, it was an honor and a pleasure. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.